Good morning, everyone. Today we will discuss the chapter The Story of an Hour for classes plus 1 and plus 2. So by the end of this video, you will be able to learn about the author of the chapter. You will be able to learn about the summary of the chapter. You will be able to learn about the theme of the chapter. And you will be able to learn about the style of the chapter. Let us quickly discuss about the author. Kate Chopin was an American writer best known for her stories about the lives of sensitive, daring women. Catherine O'Flaherty, that is Kate, was born in St. Louis, Missouri, USA on February 8, 1850. Let us discuss about the story. Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour tells the story of Louise Mallet, who begins to experience her newfound freedom as soon as she hears of her husband's death. His death frees her from her imprisonment in marriage, taking control of her life as she descends the staircase. The sight of her husband entering the house becomes a joy that kills her. Now children, what is the meaning of descends? Descends means comes down. So the story of an hour, as the title suggests, completes in 1 hour, during which many significant events in the life of Mrs. Mallet takes place. The news of the death of her husband makes her experience an unusual state of freedom and makes her dream of her future. This dream, however, is rudely shaken at the end of the story when her husband enters the house, and this becomes a joy that kills her. Let us quickly discuss the summary through the signpost. Mrs. Mallet, who was a heart patient, was given the news of her husband's death by her sister Josephine. Now Mrs. Mallet, a pretty young woman, is a heart patient. When the news of the death of her husband is confirmed by his friend Richards, he and Mrs. Mallet's sister Josephine are alarmed. They are puzzled how to break the news to her. They take every care to convey the news as gently as possible. But Mrs. Mallet, it is feared, may not receive a sudden shock. What shock? The shock of her husband's death. So Josephine dances around the truth until Mrs. Mallet finally understands what has happened. In the meantime, Richards, who is Richards? Mrs. Mallet's husband's friend. So in the meantime, Richards hangs out with them for moral support. He stays there with Josephine and Mrs. Mallet. Mrs. Mallet reacted tragically. She wept at once, suddenly and wildly. Mrs. Mallet acts differently from most women in the same position who might disbelieve it. She weeps passionately in her sister's arms. Louise locked herself in her room upstairs and stood facing the open window. Who is Louise, children? This is Mrs. Mallet. So Mrs. Mallet is named as Louise Mallet. So when the storm of grief has spent itself, when she had been able to control herself, she decides to go to her room to be by herself. In her room, Mrs. Mallet sits down in a comfortable chair and feels completely depleted. She looks out of the window. For once in her life, delighted by the natural world in front of her, she felt young and strong. So she can see before her tops of trees that are all fresh and alive with the new spring life. The delicious breath of the rain is in the air. She hears the notes of a distant song and twittering of sparrows. That is all the natural world. She sits still, occasionally sobbing briefly like a kid. She is young and fair, but due to this news, she looks preoccupied. With the news of her husband's death, she felt free. It was her moment of self-discovery. So suddenly Mrs. Mallet realizes that something is approaching her. She waits fearfully for this unknown thing, unknown feeling or unknown knowledge. She breathes heavily and tries to resist before succumbing to this new knowledge. What is this new knowledge? This new knowledge is a feeling of her freedom. She thinks to herself how she will cry when she sees the dead body of her husband. So you see the sudden change in her emotions. Earlier she was crying wildly, and now she is wondering how she would even cry when she would see the dead body of her husband. She is kind of excited about the chance to make her own decisions and not feel accountable to anyone. With open arms, she welcomed herself to a life full of freedom. Her body and soul were free from the clutches of matrimony. Now, what are clutches? That is a tight grasp. Matrimony, that is married life. So she feels even more swept by the idea of freedom than the fact that she had sometimes felt love for her husband. She now focuses on how free she is, how liberated she is from the clutches of the matrimony. Fearing that Louise would make herself ill, Josephine, her sister, begged her to open the door. Mrs. Mallet opened the door and carried herself as if she were the goddess of victory. Now, outside the locked door of Mrs. Mallet, Josephine, her sister, who believes that Mrs. Mallet must be crying wildly, kneels with her lips to the keyhole and implores for admission. She begs for her to let her come in. She says, "Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door." Now Mrs. Mallet tells her to go away, and she fantasizes about the exciting life ahead. Finally, overcome by her sister's regular pleading, she opens the door and she is ready to go with her. They descend the stairs. Now she carries herself as if she were the goddess of victory. Both the sisters descended the stairs only to find out that Mrs. Mallet's husband, Brentley Mallet, was never dead. Suddenly the door opens and Mr. Mallet, carrying his gripsack and umbrella, comes in. He is not dead, and he doesn't even know anyone thought he was dead. The sight of her husband shocked her to her death. The doctors confirmed that she died of the joy that kills. Now Richards and Josephine tried to protect Mrs. Mallet from the sight, but they failed to do so. Mrs. Mallet sees her husband and receives the shock they had tried to prevent earlier, and she dies. Later, the medical people who examine her say that she was full of so much happiness that it had killed her. But children, we know that it was not the joy that had killed her. It was actually the sadness that she had lost her freedom from the clutches of matrimony. That was the reason due to which she died. Let us discuss the setting of the story now. The setting of the story of An Hour is unspecified. Chopin does not offer many clues as to where or when the action takes place. This means no line in the chapter tells us where the story was set and when was the story set. However, the story takes place during Chopin's time, the late 19th century, in the Mallet's house. The only change in setting takes place when Louise Mallet moves from the ground floor to the first floor and then she comes back. The setting is symbolic of the protagonist's movement. Now children, who is the protagonist? Protagonist is the main character of the story. Now here in this story, we are talking about Mrs. Mallet. When downstairs, it reflects her imprisoned self, whereas the window on the first floor symbolizes the means to see the visions of the outside world as per her choice. So when she is downstairs, when she cries wildly at the news of her husband's death, it shows her restrainment. It shows how imprisoned she was in her marriage. Whereas when she goes on the first floor, through the window, she sees that she can also be free. She sees the visions of the outside world as she wants to see. Let us now discuss the themes of the chapter. The plot of the story deals with the theme of female self-discovery and identity. When Mrs. Mallet learns of her husband's death, she is overcome with grief. Now children, what is the meaning of overcome? It means overpowered. But when she is alone in her bedroom, she begins to feel a previously unknown sense of freedom and relief. What does this actually tell us? This tells us that women at that time felt restrained in the clutches of the matrimony, like Mrs. Mallet did. So it was when she was alone in her bedroom, through the window, she could realize that she also can have a sense of freedom and relief, which was previously unknown to her. At first, she is frightened of her new insight. Now children, what is the meaning of insight? Insight means the capacity to gain something accurately. She knew that she was getting something, but she was afraid to get that insight. There was something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. So she knew that something was coming to her, but she was too scared to accept it. When she first says the words free, 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 she is said to have abandoned herself. So when she says these words free, 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 she unrestrains herself. But after she speaks these words, she relaxes and gains more control over herself. As she imagines her life without her husband, she enjoys visions of the future. She realizes that whether or not she had loved him was less important than this possession of self-assertion she now feels. Now children, what is the meaning of self-assertion? It means the confident and forceful expression of oneself. Now Mrs. Mallet gives less importance to the fact that she loved her husband or not, but she gives more importance to the possession she has now got, that is the possession of self-assertion. She now imagines her life without her husband, where she enjoys the visions of the future. She enjoys seeing herself free. She can live the way she wants to, and she can do whatever she had ever wanted to. Louise recognizes the idea of attaining selfhood and identity as a woman, which she could not feel when she was in the marriage. That means when she was in the clutches of that marriage, where she never felt that she was free. It was such a strong force that when she realized that her husband was alive, she immediately collapsed. So she had envisioned herself so much free that she could not bear the sight of her husband, because she knew that her freedom, her newfound freedom, will again be restrained. She will have to live the way her husband had wanted her to. Chopin suggests that Louise could not bear to abandon her newfound freedom. She could not leave her newfound freedom, and she could not return to life with her husband, where she would be required to bend her will to his, where she'll have to do whatever her husband had wanted her to do. Let us discuss about the next theme, that is role of women in marriage. Conventions of marriage. Conventions are the customs of marriage. So another theme in the story is the theme of role of women in marriage. Mrs. Mallet is known in the beginning of the story only as a wife. Very little is known about her and her husband, Mrs. and Mr. Mallet's relationship. Even Louise is unsure whether or not they had been happily married. She even hasn't ever thought whether she was happy living with her husband or not. And yet, sometimes she had loved. It was only sometimes when she felt love for her husband. Often she had not. What did it matter? So often she had not felt any sort of love for her husband. But that did not matter to anyone. The conventions of marriage overshadow the specifics of a husband-wife relationship. Thus, society's concern was more important than the couple's personal relationship. Whether they were happy with each other or not, whether they loved each other or not, was not of importance. What was of more importance was society's concern. They were more important than even the couple's personal relationship. Louis' confinement in marriage. Now children, what is confinement? It means restriction. So Louise, when alone in her bedroom, begins to feel free and happy. Free from her marriage, free from the clutches of the matrimony. She feels this newfound freedom coming to her that she had never experienced before. It is the joy at her husband's death that makes the readers realize the confinement she was in. So when she gets happy at the death of her husband, it is the time when the readers realize that she was not happy with her husband. She thus feels released from the clutches of matrimony because she can do whatever she wants to and she is free. Louise's rebirth. Only when Louise feels free from the shadow of her husband, Louise appears young and calm. Everything around her is in full bloom. Spring has arrived, as opposed to the time before her husband's death, when she felt dead and lifeless. Now, this is the comparison between when she was married and her husband was alive, and now when her husband has died. Earlier, she felt dead and lifeless when she was with her husband. But now everything around her is in full bloom, as if spring has arrived for her. The next theme of the chapter, children, is male domination. She now realizes that there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. Now children, she had now realized after her husband's death that there will be no other powerful bending than her own self, in which blind persistent all the men and women believed that they have a right to force their will on their fellow creature. Whether one is acting out of love or not, Chopin seems to be making a comment on the 19th century marriages, which granted the man the right to own and dominate another. Who is another here? The woman. So in the 19th century marriages, children, the woman was not given any right, whereas the man had the right to dominate the woman. This theme of male domination in the life of women was popular in an era when women were not even allowed to vote. They were not given any single right. Let us now discuss the style of the chapter, narrative technique and structure. The Story of an Hour is a short story. It is made up of a series of short paragraphs, many of which consist of just 2 or 3 sentences. Moreover, the story covers only 1 hour from the moment Louise Mallet hears of her husband's death to the moment of his shocking return. So the complete story is set up in just 1 hour. The story begins from the death of Mrs. Mallet's husband's news, and it ends when she dies after seeing her husband alive. This 1 hour of Louise's life thus intensely reveals her inner psyche through an omniscient third-person narrator. Now children, what is the meaning of omniscient? It means knowing everything. And in this story, it is the third-person narrator. This enables the author to put forward a complete view, not one limited to the protagonist's point of view. Now children, the presence of this third-person narrator helps the reader to understand the inner psyche of Mrs. Mallet. The use of third-person omniscient narrative voice also ensures the readers are more sympathetic and understanding to Mrs. Mallet. Now this third-person narrator also helps the readers to build a more sympathetic and understanding feeling for Mrs. Mallet. It is only for a brief moment that the narrator lends her character's voice. That is, when Josephine begs Louise to open the door. So the other character, that is Josephine, speaks only for a brief moment. So children, the story is told in this third person by the omniscient narrator. It moves from the present to the future. However, the movement is very limited. Everything happens in a brief period of an hour. The way the author builds up suspense for a surprise ending is brilliant and it deserves a praise. So let us discuss the next point, that is Hourglass Movement. The narrator tells the story of an hour in an hourglass formed with Brentley as one half of it and Louise the other. Now children, you must have seen the hourglass. It is an apparatus which consists of two glass tubes. One half of it is filled with sand, and with the passage of time, sand passes from one half to another. So in the story, one half depicts Mrs. Mallet and another half depicts Mr. Mallet. The news of Brentley's death fills the other side with life. So who is the other side depicting? The other side is Mrs. Mallet, and she is filled with life when she learns about the death of her husband. Brentley's death thus causes her rebirth. When Louise sees Brentley standing before her, her rebirth ends. For just as his death occasioned her rebirth, his rebirth occasions her death. So when she hears the news of her husband's death, she feels alive. And when the husband returns alive, she gets dead. Louise Mallet thus moves from death to life and back to death in an hourglass movement. So just in 1 hour, the entire process of birth to death and death to birth happens. So children, that is all about summary, themes and narrative technique of the chapter. Now for your homework, you will revise themes. Thank you.